Imagine walking into a doctor's office, hoping to get the care you need, but instead of being greeted with compassion, you're met with something unexpected and horrifying. What if the very person sworn to protect your health turned their back on you simply because of the color of your skin? In today's story, a black patient walks into a hospital, desperate for medical attention. But when they meet with the doctor, something disturbing happens. The doctor, who has the power to make life-saving decisions, refuses to provide any treatment, offering nothing but cold indifference. The reason? The doctor's deeply rooted bias against people of color. What should have been a routine visit turns into a battle for dignity, justice, and basic humanity. The doctor's refusal isn't just an isolated incident, it's a reflection of a larger, more insidious issue of racial inequality that continues to permeate various sectors of society. But this isn't just a story about racism. It's about the unexpected turn of events that unfolds next, a twist so shocking, it might make you rethink everything you know about the healthcare system and human compassion. As we dig deeper into this disturbing encounter, you'll see how one patient's determination and courage sets off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What happens next? Well, let's just say that not everyone can get away with treating people this way, and in the end, it's not just the patient who's fighting for justice. The story takes an unexpected turn, with the community, the hospital staff, and even the doctor's colleagues questioning what went wrong and how far they'll go to correct this injustice. What would you do if you were in the patient's shoes? Would you simply walk away, defeated, or would you stand up for your rights and demand what is just? Keep watching, because the next part of this story will shock you. The battle for equality, fairness, and humanity is far from over, and it's about to take a turn no one saw coming. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. The patient, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger, stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The doctor's words echoed in their mind. "I can't help you." No explanation, no empathy, just a cold refusal to offer treatment. The patient had walked into that office hoping for a diagnosis, a solution to the pain they'd been struggling with for months. They never imagined that their biggest hurdle would be the person whose job it was to heal them. In that moment, a sense of powerlessness crept in. The feeling of being dehumanized, of being dismissed solely because of something they couldn't control, the color of their skin. It was a harsh reminder of a painful reality that many people of color know all too well. They weren't just a patient anymore. They had become a statistic in a system that, at times, seemed designed to push them to the margins. But this patient wasn't willing to be just another victim. They refused to accept this injustice without a fight. The silence in the room was deafening. The doctor stood there, arms folded, offering no explanation, no apology. They didn't even seem to notice the hurt on the patient's face. It was as if they saw them as nothing more than a nuisance. The patient, struggling to keep their composure, could feel their heart racing. What could they possibly say? What was left to say when someone in a position of power treated them with such disdain? But as they looked around the room, something unexpected happened. They noticed other staff members, the nurses who had been standing nearby. Some of them seemed uncomfortable, their eyes flicking nervously between patient and doctor. A few exchanged glances, but none spoke up. Was this how things had always been in this hospital? Were they complicit in doctor's refusal to treat? The patient took a deep breath. It was now or never. They gathered every ounce of courage they had, refusing to let fear control them. "I'm not leaving," they said, their voice steady but firm. "You can't just turn me away like this." The doctor's face hardened, but before they could respond, a nurse stepped forward, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "Please let me see what I can do," she said, glancing at Doctor, who simply shook their head and turned away. The nurse's gesture was small, but it was enough to show the patient that not everyone in that room was indifferent to their suffering. The nurse led the patient to another room, where she quickly took down their symptoms and asked about their medical history. She seemed genuinely concerned, her demeanor soft and compassionate. It was a stark contrast to the cold treatment they had just received. As the nurse spoke, the patient couldn't help but wonder why things were so different. Why had the doctor acted the way they did? Was it a personal bias, or was it something more systemic, a deeper issue that extended beyond this single interaction? Despite the nurse's kindness, the feeling of injustice still lingered. They couldn't stop thinking about how the doctor had just dismissed them, without a second thought. It wasn't just a rejection of medical care, it was a rejection of their humanity. And the more they thought about it, the angrier they became. How many others had experienced the same thing? How many people had been treated this way, in silence, with no one to stand up for them? The nurse finished taking their information and excused herself, promising to bring in a doctor who would actually offer the care they needed. As the patients sat alone in the sterile room, their mind raced. It was clear that something wasn't right in this hospital. But how could they possibly expose what had happened without facing retaliation? Was anyone even willing to listen to their story? The silence of the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The patient's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the door. The nurse returned, but this time, she wasn't alone. A new doctor had entered the room. He was older, with a kind expression that immediately put the patient at ease. "I'm so sorry for the way you were treated earlier," the doctor began, his voice gentle. "That should never have happened." The patient was taken aback. It wasn't every day that someone in a position of power took responsibility for the actions of their colleagues. But the sincerity in his voice made them wonder if this doctor was truly different, or if he was just saying the right words. "I've read through your file," the doctor continued, "and I'll make sure you receive the care you need." For the first time in what felt like forever, the patient allowed themselves to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, they wouldn't be dismissed. Maybe this time, they would get the treatment they deserved. But even as the doctor made his promises, the patient couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They couldn't stop thinking about the doctor who had refused to treat them, the one who had shown such blatant disregard for their well-being. What if this wasn't just an isolated incident? What if the doctor's actions were part of something much larger, a systemic issue that affected countless other patients? The questions continued to swirl in the patient's mind as they left the room, now with a diagnosis and a plan for treatment. They still had to figure out what to do next. How could they make sure this didn't happen to someone else? How could they bring the truth to light without putting themselves at risk? But one thing was certain, they couldn't stay silent. They couldn't let this doctor's refusal to treat them go unchallenged. Over the next few days, the patient began to dig deeper into the hospital's history, looking for any signs of discrimination or malpractice. They reached out to former patients, gathering stories and evidence of similar experiences. What they found shocked them. This wasn't just one racist doctor. It was a pattern, a troubling trend that had gone unnoticed for far too long. As the patient dug further, they discovered something even more disturbing. The doctor who had refused to treat them had a history of complaints, but nothing had ever been done to hold them accountable. It seemed like the hospital was more concerned with protecting its reputation than ensuring its patients received fair and equal treatment. The more the patient uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the problem ran. It wasn't just a matter of one doctor's prejudice. It was a cultural issue, a toxic environment that allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. And worse, there were people in positions of power who were actively covering it up, making sure that no one knew the truth. The patient knew they couldn't let this go. They had to expose what was happening, no matter the cost. But the stakes were high. They had seen how quickly people were willing to look the other way when it came to racism. What if the hospital turned against them? What if their efforts were in vain? Even as they gathered evidence and formulated a plan, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The fear of retaliation loomed large, and yet they knew they had no choice. The truth had to come out. And so, they prepared to take the next step, fully aware of the risks. What would happen when they confronted the hospital's leadership? Would they be listened to, or would they be silenced, just like so many before them? The tension was palpable, and the future uncertain. But one thing was for sure, this patient's fight for justice had only just begun. The patient's mind was in overdrive as they walked through the quiet hallways of the hospital, their footsteps echoing off the sterile walls. Every inch of the place felt different now, as if the weight of everything they had uncovered had shifted the way they saw the world around them. What had once seemed like a place of healing now felt like a labyrinth of power, secrets, and fear. They had seen the way the staff had looked away when they'd been turned down for treatment, but now, it was more than just a few uncomfortable glances. It was a reflection of a larger truth that no one seemed willing to confront. The hospital was a microcosm of something far more insidious, something that extended beyond this one incident, beyond this one doctor. The more the patient thought about it, the clearer it became that they were not alone in their experience. There were countless others who had suffered in silence, swept under the rug by an institution more interested in maintaining its reputation than in confronting its own ugly truths. But who could they trust? Who would stand with them in this fight for justice? They started by reaching out to former patients, hoping for any clues or validation that could help expose the hospital's dark underbelly. It wasn't easy. Many of them had moved on with their lives, or worse, had been too frightened by the system to speak up. Some had tried to file complaints but found their voices ignored or dismissed. Others had simply given up, accepting the status quo as an unfortunate reality. But the patient was relentless. Every call, every email, every conversation brought them closer to the truth. And with each step forward, the weight of what they were uncovering grew heavier. One evening, after days of speaking to former patients, the patient met with an anonymous source, someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of the hospital's practices. The source was cautious, speaking in hushed tones and only revealing small bits of information at a time. But what they said made the patient's blood run cold. "It's not just the doctor you encountered," the source had whispered. "There are others like him, and they're protected by the system." The system. The word hung in the air, loaded with meaning. This was bigger than just one doctor. It was about a culture, an environment where bias and prejudice festered unchecked, where patients of color were more likely to be mistreated or dismissed without a second thought. The more the patient listened, the more they realized how deep the route went. There were whispers of patients being denied care, of doctors making disparaging comments, of nurses turning a blind eye to systemic discrimination. It was a network, a silent agreement to uphold a system that allowed these injustices to continue. But as the patient dug deeper, they began to feel a sense of isolation. Everyone they spoke to seemed afraid of the repercussions, afraid of the power the hospital held over their lives. Many of the staff, from nurses to administrative assistants, had seen the truth but stayed silent, too fearful to speak out. It was as if the hospital had become a fortress, its walls built not only to protect its patients but to protect itself from the very people it was supposed to serve. And yet the patient couldn't stop. The truth was too important. They had already taken the first step, and there was no going back now. But with each step the danger grew. They began to feel as though they were being watched, the unsettling feeling that someone, somewhere, was aware of their investigation, following their every move. At times, they wondered if they were just being paranoid, but there was always a nagging feeling in the back of their mind. What if they were being targeted? What if their search for justice had made them a target themselves? Meanwhile, the doctor who had initially refused treatment to the patient continued his work as if nothing had happened. He carried on with his rounds, indifferent to the growing tension around him. But the patient wasn't the only one who had noticed his behavior. There were murmurs among the staff, subtle comments about his attitude, his reluctance to treat certain patients. But those whispers quickly died down whenever the hospital's leadership was mentioned. The higher-ups had always been quick to protect him, as if his position and reputation were more important than the lives of those he was supposed to care for. What could the patient do? The system seemed too powerful, too entrenched to break. But still, they pushed forward, unwilling to let fear control them. They began documenting every detail, every conversation, every piece of evidence they could gather. They couldn't just expose the doctor's actions, they had to expose everything. The patterns, the cover-ups, the willingness to look the other way, it all had to come to light. It was during one of these late-night investigations, sitting alone in a dimly lit apartment surrounded by papers and files, that the patient stumbled upon something unexpected. A name. A familiar name. The hospital's CEO. They had never connected the dots before, but now, everything seemed to fall into place. The CEO had been involved in several major decisions regarding staffing, and over the years, had developed a reputation for ignoring complaints about bias and mistreatment. The pieces began to fit together like a puzzle. The doctor's behavior was no accident, it was part of a larger pattern that was being allowed to flourish at the highest levels of the hospital. The very people who were supposed to hold the institution accountable were the ones protecting its darkest secrets. The realization hit the patient like a tidal wave. They had been thinking too small. This wasn't just about one doctor, it was about an entire system that was broken, corrupt, and complicit in perpetuating harm. But now, the question loomed larger than ever: how could they take down such a powerful institution? How could one person expose the extent of the corruption without being crushed under its weight? Days passed, and the tension only grew. The patient's sense of unease deepened, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. They noticed that the hospital had started to change its routine. Security personnel were more present, more vigilant. Nurses and staff who had once been sympathetic were now acting distant, even cold. It was as though the walls were closing in, and the patient couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something dangerous. And yet they couldn't stop. The fire of injustice burned too brightly within them. They had to speak out, to make sure that others wouldn't suffer in silence like they had. But with each passing day, they wondered just how far they could push before the system fought back. Could they truly bring the truth to light? Or was it already too late? The hospital's silence hung over everything like a heavy fog, and the patient knew that they were getting closer to something. But what would it cost them? The patient could feel the pressure mounting, the walls of their world narrowing with each passing day. It wasn't just the investigation that was wearing them down. It was the growing sense of being pursued, hunted even. They'd been careful, meticulous in covering their tracks, but it was becoming harder to shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what they were doing. The hospital's vigilance had increased. The security cameras seemed to be watching their every move, and even the janitorial staff seemed to be eyeing them with suspicion. They couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if something darker was at play. Every time they went to speak with someone who might know the truth, they found themselves on edge, constantly looking over their shoulder. A few nurses had shown signs of wavering, their once sympathetic expressions replaced with nervous glances. But despite their discomfort, none of them were brave enough to speak out. The weight of the institution was too heavy, and the patient could feel that fear in their bones. It wasn't just the doctors who were complicit in this system of silence, it was everyone. The staff had learned to keep their heads down, to ignore what they saw, because speaking up came at a cost one they weren't sure they were willing to pay. The deeper the patient dug, the more they realized how intricate the web was. It wasn't just about exposing the racism of one doctor, it was about unraveling an entire culture of negligence and bias that stretched far beyond the walls of this hospital. The patient had collected names, dates, and documents, evidence of countless patients who had been overlooked, mistreated, or ignored because of their race. But every time they tried to reach out, every time they thought they had found a way to shine a light on the truth, something stopped them. The hospital was too powerful, the risks too high. and then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a late evening when their phone buzzed. A number they didn't recognize, but something in their gut told them to answer. The voice on the other end was shaky, but familiar, one of the nurses who had shown subtle signs of support in the past. "You need to be careful," she warned, her voice low, almost a whisper. "They know. They know you're digging around." The patient's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Who knows? The hospital. Security's been watching you. They've been monitoring your calls. They know what you're up to." The patient felt their blood run cold. They had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. "What should I do?" The nurse hesitated, a long pause on the other end. "I don't know how much longer I can protect you. If they find out I'm helping you, I'll lose my job. But you're too close to the truth. They can't let you expose this. You need to make a decision. Now." The line went dead before the patient could respond. The room was silent except for the pounding of their heart. They had been too close for too long. The truth was within their grasp, but now it felt like the hospital was preparing to crush them before they could expose it. It wasn't just a matter of getting the story out anymore, it was a matter of survival. The patient had to act quickly. The evidence they had gathered was invaluable, but they couldn't do it alone anymore. They needed someone who had the power to bring the story into the light. But the question remained, who could they trust? Who would take on such a powerful institution without being silenced in return? They thought of the doctor, the one who had initially refused to treat them. His actions were just the tip of the iceberg. But now, with the hospital's tightening grip, they couldn't afford to wait for anyone else to step forward. They had to take the risk. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. The system had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long, and if they didn't act now, the cycle of silence and abuse would continue. But as the patient began to put their plan into motion, they realized that there was a new layer to the game they hadn't considered. The hospital wasn't just protecting its own, it was protecting something much bigger. They were covering up more than just racist behavior. The patient had uncovered hints of financial corruption, of misappropriated funds meant for patient care, and questionable deals with pharmaceutical companies. The racism was just one piece of the puzzle. The deeper they went, the more they realized that they were threatening to expose an entire network of deceit, a machine that could easily crush anyone who dared to stand in its way. Time was running out. The patient knew they were being watched more closely than ever. The hospital had likely already begun to track their every movement. They couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even the nurse who had warned them. The stakes had become too high, the consequences too severe. In a final act of desperation, the patient decided to go public. They couldn't keep waiting for the right moment. They couldn't risk losing everything they had worked for. They contacted a journalist, someone they knew had experience with whistleblower cases, someone who had brought down corrupt institutions before. But even as they made the call, doubt crept in. Could they trust this person? What if it was a trap? The journalist agreed to meet, but only in a public place, far from the hospital's reach. The meeting was set for the next day, in a quiet CAF in the city center. The patient arrived early, nerves rattling, heart pounding in their chest. They couldn't help but wonder if this was the right choice. Could they really take down such a powerful institution? Could they survive the fallout if things went wrong? Every moment felt like a countdown. The CAF was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, but to the patient, everything felt muted, distant. They scanned the room, waiting for the journalist to appear. Their eyes kept flicking to the door, looking for any sign of danger. It wasn't just the hospital they were up against now, it was the system, the people in power who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Suddenly, the door opened, and the patient's heart skipped a beat. It was the journalist, stepping into the CAF, eyes scanning the room for the patient. They locked eyes for a brief second, and the journalists made their way over to the table. The patient sat up straighter, trying to steady their breath. This was it. The moment they had been building toward. The moment that could bring everything crashing down, or everything crashing in on them. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension thick between them. And then, the patient finally spoke, their voice steady but laced with the weight of everything they had uncovered. "I'm ready," they said. "Let's expose the truth." As the patient sat across from the journalist, they could feel the weight of the moment. The evidence was gathered, the risks calculated. This was the turning point finally, the chance to expose the corrupt practices, the systemic racism, the abuse that had festered in silence for far too long. They handed over the files, watching the journalist's expression closely as they flipped through the documents. But as the journalist's eyes scanned the pages, something shifted. The calmness that had previously seemed reassuring was replaced with a slight furrow in their brow, a hesitation that set the patient on edge. "I need to be sure," the journalist said quietly, tapping a finger on the file. "These documents. They're important. But something doesn't add up." The patient's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The journalists paused, their gaze narrowing as they met the patient's eyes. "The names you've mentioned, there's something about them. They're linked to more than just the hospital." The patient's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" The journalists leaned in closer, lowering their voice even more. "The doctor you're after? He's not just a rogue figure within the system. He's connected to a much larger network. The hospital is just the surface. There's something deeper, something more dangerous that we're dealing with here." The patient's heart began to pound. They had suspected that the hospital's corruption went beyond just one doctor, but they hadn't expected it to be this far-reaching. "What network?" they asked, trying to steady their breathing. The journalist hesitated, glancing around the CAF, as if making sure they weren't being overheard. "The connections go beyond healthcare. We're talking about powerful figures, corporate interests, politicians. The hospital is a front for a larger operation, one that's been under the radar for years. And you've just stumbled into it." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The patient felt the ground beneath them shift, as if everything they had been working toward, everything they had uncovered, was just the tip of the iceberg. The stakes were no longer just about exposing one doctor, one institution. This was something much larger, something that could bring down more than just a hospital. They were now tangled in a web that stretched across industries, a web so tangled that exposing it might be impossible without destroying everything in the process. The journalist continued, their voice low and tense. "You need to understand something. You're not just fighting the hospital now. You're up against a powerful network of people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. If you keep pushing forward, they won't just target you, they'll target everyone you know." The patient's mind raced. Every conversation, every decision, every choice they'd made suddenly felt like it had led them into a trap. This wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. This was about survival. They had already crossed a line, there was no going back now. The truth was dangerous, but so was the idea of keeping silent. They had to press on, but the question remained, how could they defeat something so vast, so deeply entrenched, without being crushed under the weight of it all? The journalist's eyes softened slightly, sensing the patient's struggle. "I want to help," they said, "but this isn't just a story anymore. This is a war. You need to decide how far you're willing to go." The tension in the room thickened. The patient could feel it, the magnitude of what they were up against. But what were they really willing to sacrifice? Could they expose this network without losing themselves in the process? Could they protect the people they loved while bringing the truth to light? Before they could respond, the CAF door suddenly swung open with a loud creak, and a figure stepped inside. The patient's pulse quickened, their gaze snapping toward the entrance. The figure's silhouette was familiar, but for a moment, they couldn't place it. The room seemed to blur around them as the figure moved toward the counter, their presence sending a wave of unease through the air. It wasn't until the figure turned slightly, catching the patient's eye, that the realization hit. It was someone from the hospital. A high-ranking staff member, someone they hadn't seen in years. Their eyes locked for a brief, terrifying moment. And then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, they turned and walked out, disappearing into the street. The patient's breath caught in their throat. The journalist was watching them closely, and the urgency in their eyes was unmistakable. "Do you know him?" they asked quietly. The patient's mind raced. There was no way this could be a coincidence. The staff member wasn't just passing by, he had seen them, recognized them. And if he was here, it meant the hospital knew more about the investigation than they had ever imagined. They had been too careless, too confident that they could outmaneuver the system. They had just made a deadly mistake. The journalist stood up quickly, their voice tight with concern. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as the patient made to leave, their phone buzzed again, a message, one they had been dreading. It was from the nurse who had warned them earlier. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they feared. "They know. You're being watched. You need to disappear now." The message was followed by a second one, just as chilling. "Don't trust the journalist." The room seemed to spin as the weight of the nurse's warning settled in. Could it be true? Had the journalist been part of the system all along, setting them up for something far worse? The patient's mind was racing, torn between the need to trust someone, anyone, and the gut-wrenching suspicion that they had been walking into a trap all along. With every passing second, the situation became more dangerous, more unpredictable. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't make sense. The hospital, the doctor, the mysterious network, it was all connected, but the full picture remained elusive. The patient's instincts screamed that they had to act quickly. They couldn't let themselves be cornered, couldn't let the truth slip further away. But now, more than ever, they didn't know who to trust. The stakes had never been higher. The risks had never been greater. And yet, there was no turning back. The patient's pulse raced as they stepped out of the CAF, heart pounding with adrenaline. The urgency was undeniable. Something was closing in, tightening like a vice around them. They hadn't planned for this, hadn't anticipated that the hospital would catch on so quickly, or that their every move would be under surveillance. But now, there was no time to second-guess themselves. They had to act. The patient's mind was a whirlwind, jumping from thought to thought. The nurse's warning played over and over in their head, mixing with the journalist's cryptic words. Don't trust the journalist. Could it be possible? Were they walking into a trap? They couldn't risk staying any longer. Without hesitation, they texted the journalist, telling them that they had to leave the meeting immediately. They didn't trust anyone anymore. They had no idea who was behind this web, but it was clear that the stakes had escalated far beyond just exposing one corrupt doctor. The hospital was just one part of a larger system, and now, it seemed like every person in their life could be a potential part of that system. As they stepped into their car, they tried to steady their breathing, but panic was starting to claw at them. The streets were dimly lit, the occasional passing car casting shadows that felt like silent watchers. The patient's eyes darted to every rearview mirror, constantly checking their surroundings. Were they being followed? Minutes passed, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, as they neared a quiet intersection, their phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. They hesitated, but curiosity got the best of them. With a shaky hand, they answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and distorted, almost unrecognizable. "You should have stopped, long ago." The patient's breath caught. "Who is this?" A long pause followed. Someone who knows exactly what you're doing. Someone who's been watching you. The line went dead. The patient's mind raced again, trying to connect the dots. Had it been the journalist? The hospital? Or someone else entirely? There was no telling. What was clear, however, was that they were in danger. Real danger. As they rounded another corner, a sleek black car suddenly appeared behind them, its headlights bright and unblinking. The patient's stomach dropped. They sped up, but the car mirrored their movements, staying just close enough to make them feel trapped, isolated. The streetlights flickered overhead, and the tension in the air was palpable. They couldn't outrun this. The chase was inevitable. In desperation, they took a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to lose the car, but it followed. Their hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with the pressure. It was clear now they were being pursued by someone who knew exactly how to keep them in check. This wasn't just about stopping an investigation anymore. This was about silencing them. But then, just as the patient was about to make another desperate turn, the pursuing car cut them off. It was close, too close. The patient slammed on the brakes, heart hammering in their chest. The black car screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their way. For a long, frozen moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, the driver's side door of the black car opened, and a man stepped out, his figure tall and imposing, his movements slow and deliberate. The patient's breath hitched. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't just the man's appearance that struck the patient with dread, it was the familiarity in his eyes. "You," the patient muttered under their breath, barely able to comprehend the shock. The man took a step forward, his voice calm but chilling. "It's over. You've made your choice. Now you need to live with the consequences." The patient's mind spun. The man's face, he knew him, or at least recognized him. But how? It was impossible. Was this a setup? Had they been manipulated from the start? "Who are you?" the patient demanded, trying to steady their voice despite the panic welling up inside them. The man's lips curled into a small, almost pitying smile. "You really didn't think it was just the hospital, did you? You thought you were fighting a single corrupt institution. But you've been poking around in something much bigger than that. Something you don't understand." The patient's mind was racing, but nothing was making sense. The man continued, his voice now more forceful. "You've been playing with fire. The hospital, the doctor, the entire network, it's all connected. But it's not just about healthcare. It's about control, power, money. It's about shaping the world behind the scenes, and you're standing in the way." The pieces were falling together, but they were still too scattered to form any meaningful picture. "You're part of this," the patient said slowly, realization creeping in. "You're one of them." The man nodded, his face unreadable. "Yes. But you're not the first to try and expose us. And you won't be the last." Suddenly, a flash of movement. The patient's heart leaped in their chest as a second figure emerged from the shadows, standing on the passenger side of the car. The journalist. The patient's breath stopped. The journalist had been part of this the entire time. They had been working for the system all along, leading the patient into this trap. The betrayal hit harder than anything the patient had imagined. The journalist wasn't the ally they thought they were. They had been playing a dangerous game, pulling the patient closer to the fire until it was too late to escape. "Why?" the patient whispered, their voice barely audible. The journalist stepped forward, their expression cold. "I was just doing my job. You were never supposed to get this far." The patient stood there, caught between the two figures, feeling the weight of everything crashing down. They had been too trusting, too naive. The truth they had fought so hard for now felt like a distant, unreachable dream. And then, just when it seemed like the world was closing in on them, the unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the night, and the man who had been threatening them stumbled backward, clutching his chest. The journalist's eyes widened in shock. The patient turned, their heart skipping a beat, and saw a figure in the distance. It was the nurse. The same nurse who had warned them earlier, the one who had shown them subtle signs of support. "Get in the car!" The nurse shouted, voice urgent. Without hesitation, the patient sprinted toward the car, barely dodging the hail of gunfire that erupted from behind them. They jumped into the passenger seat, heart pounding as the nurse slammed the door and floored the accelerator. The two figures were left behind, the black car speeding into the night as the patient's world spun into chaos. But as they drove through the dark streets, the patient's mind was still racing. They hadn't just uncovered one hospital's secrets, they had exposed a network of corruption, power, and deceit that stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. And though they had survived this battle, the war was far from over. The car swerved through the winding streets, tires screeching as the nurse pushed the vehicle to its limits. The patient sat in the passenger seat, breathless and still processing the chaos that had just unfolded. Every inch of their body screamed with adrenaline, but their mind was running wild. They had barely escaped with their life, but what now? What could they do with the truth that had almost cost them everything? The nurse didn't speak at first, eyes fixed on the road, hands steady on the wheel. The tension in the air was suffocating. Finally, when they reached a more secluded area, the nurse slowed the car and pulled over. "We're not safe yet," the nurse said quietly, glancing at the rearview mirror. The patient nodded, still dazed. They could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. This wasn't just about getting away. This was about survival. The system they had uncovered, the corruption, it was bigger than they had imagined. It wasn't just about a few bad apples in the medical field. It was a network, an underground operation so vast that they had barely scratched the surface. If they were to expose it, they would have to do more than just fight for their own safety. They would have to take down the whole machine. "I'm sorry," the nurse said, breaking the silence. "I didn't want it to go this far. I was trying to help, but I didn't know who I could trust either. The people you've been up against, they're ruthless. But I can't let you face this alone." The patient looked at the nurse, their eyes narrowing. They had trusted the nurse before, but now everything seemed clouded in uncertainty. Were they just another part of the system? Or had they truly been trying to help all along? "How long have you known?" the patient asked, their voice tinged with suspicion. The nurse looked away for a moment, their expression hard to read. "Since you first started asking questions. But I didn't think you'd get this deep into it. They were watching you long before I ever saw the signs. You weren't supposed to uncover everything. I didn't know how to warn you without putting myself in danger." The patient leaned back, taking a deep breath. They had always known there was more at play here, always suspected that the hospital's corruption wasn't just about one doctor. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the danger so clearly, it was overwhelming. There was no turning back now. The truth had to come out. But at what cost? "We need to find out everything we can," the patient said finally, determination creeping into their voice. "We have to expose it all. Everything about the network, about the people involved." The nurse nodded. "But we can't do it alone. We'll need a plan. A real one. And we'll need people on our side who can protect us." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation weighing on them. The patient had already lost so much. Their trust, their safety, their peace of mind, all of it was gone. And yet, there was a flicker of hope in their heart. They had survived. And that meant they could keep fighting. The patient's mind wandered to the people they had left behind. The friends, the family. Were they safe? Were they being watched too? The fear that had settled in their chest wasn't just for themselves. It was for the people they cared about, the ones who had supported them. If they were going to take down this network, they needed to protect everyone, and that meant being smarter than ever before. "We need to go underground," the patient said. "Lay low for a while. We can't just keep rushing into the open. We need more evidence, more allies. If we're going to bring down these people, we have to do it carefully." The nurse agreed. "I know a place. A safe house. It'll be a while before anyone finds us there. But it's not permanent. We'll have to move fast." The decision was made. They would regroup, rest, and plan their next move. But as they drove toward the safe house, the patient couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hospital's network had ears everywhere. If they were careful, they could outsmart it, but the stakes had only grown higher. When they finally arrived at the safe house, the patient could feel the weight of the night sinking in. It was a small, nondescript house on the edge of town. Quiet. Hidden. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The patient and the nurse quickly settled in, taking stock of their situation. There was no time to relax. They needed to keep moving. Days turned into weeks, and during that time, the patient's investigation into the hospital's corruption continued, though now they had to be even more secretive. Every step had to be calculated. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully hidden, shared only with the people they could trust. The web of deception they were trying to untangle was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. Every new lead brought them closer to a terrifying truth. The people involved in this network were not just powerful, they were untouchable. Until they were. One night, as the patient and the nurse sat in the dimly lit living room, sifting through documents and making connections, the phone rang. It was a message from the journalist. The one who had once seemed like an ally, but whose betrayal had shattered everything. "I can help," the message read, followed by an address. "Meet me. It's the only way." The patient froze, eyes darting between the phone and the nurse. It was a risk. Trusting the journalist again could be the last mistake they ever made. But the message was clear: if they wanted the final piece of the puzzle, they had no choice but to face the one person who had turned on them. "I have to go," the patient said, their voice steady despite the growing anxiety in their chest. The nurse hesitated. "I don't like it. They might be setting you up again." "I know," the patient replied, standing up. "But if we're going to bring this down, we need every piece. Even if it means facing the past." The patient left the safe house, heart pounding in anticipation. The journalist's address led them to an old building in the city, an abandoned warehouse that had once been used for storage. They arrived in the dead of night, the streets eerily quiet. As the patient stepped inside, the dim light of the warehouse flickered to life. And there, standing at the center, was the journalist. "I'm glad you came," the journalist said, their voice laced with tension. "I was starting to think you wouldn't." The patient said nothing, studying the journalist carefully. This was at the moment they had been preparing for. The final confrontation. The moment they would either expose the whole network or disappear into the shadows forever. "What is this?" the patient asked, their voice sharp. The journalist's eyes flickered nervously. "I wasn't the only one watching. There are others, people who know about your investigation. People who want to stop you. But I've been gathering information on them, trying to figure out a way to help you without getting caught. It's dangerous, but..." The patient narrowed their eyes. "So why come to me now? After everything?" The journalist sighed, stepping closer. "Because it's too far gone. They're closing in on me. Closing in on both of us. I've seen the faces, I've heard the threats. But you're the only one who can make them listen." The tension in the air grew thick, the gravity of the moment settling in. This wasn't just about one man or one hospital anymore. It was about taking down an entire system. A system that had controlled lives, manipulated the truth, and silenced anyone who dared to speak up. "What happens now?" the patient asked, their voice steady but full of determination. The journalist hesitated, then spoke. "Now we expose them. But it won't be easy. They're prepared for this. And they'll fight back. But together, we might have a chance." And so, with the journalist's reluctant assistance, the patient set in motion a final plan to take down the powerful network they had been fighting against. It was a plan that involved every piece of evidence they had collected, every ally they had gained, and every ounce of courage they had left. The road ahead would be treacherous. But they weren't going to stop until the truth was out. In the end, it wasn't just about the patient's survival or the revenge they had once dreamed of. It was about the countless others who had been harmed by this system, whose voices had been silenced. And with that, the patient took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The system may have been vast, but the truth was unstoppable.